Good day, folks, and thank you for once again listening to Freedom's Herald. I'm Tom Gandley. For decades now, the Electoral College, a genius piece of constitutional compromise and equitable legislation, forged as part of the original U.S. Constitution in 1787, has been questioned, even condemned by a disparaging, ever hostile, and ever more entitled cabal of naysayers. What are the complaints against it? Why are they lately more openly spiteful of this piece of the U.S. Constitution, which has successfully guided U.S. presidential elections for over 230 years? Is its purpose misunderstood, or perhaps understood but nevertheless lied about? There's lately been lots of heated discussion on the subject, and I'll be back to present the facts here on Freedom's Herald right after this break.
Hello everyone, this is Brad Neufeld, host of Resilience. You can catch my show every morning, Monday through Friday at 8 a.m. right here on the Resilience Talk Network. Tune in to discover what it takes to overcome any challenge that you could face in life. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome back, folks. The U.S. Electoral College, what is it? And why exactly has so much been argued about it after recent presidential elections? And who's doing all the complaining? For most of U.S. history, the Electoral College was an accepted and understood component for determining presidential winners. For those of you listening who are a little unsure of how the Electoral College works, let me explain. Every state in the U.S. has a different population that's given seats in the House of Representatives. One representative there speaks for about 800,000 people in their district in 2019. The total federal representatives currently in the House number 435, a number that will not change, unless of course more states are added to the Union, as constitutionally every state is entitled to one representative as a minimum. In addition to population representatives, a state has 2 federal senators, regardless of population. That number can go up too if more states are added to the Union, but as it sits right now, there are 50 states with 2 senators, so 100 senators. Then there's the District of Columbia. Not a state, but full of citizens nevertheless. They get 3 representatives based on population only. No senators. Though, these numbers are assigned in the Constitution. So the House, with its 435 representatives, the Senate, with its 100 representatives, and the District of Columbia, with its 3, add up to 538 total electoral votes and voters. To win a majority, in most presidential elections, the victory goes to the one who gets 270 or more electoral votes. Obviously, in 3-way races, there are some states that vote for the third-party candidate. Those numbers change. But let's just concentrate on a Democrat versus Republican election, which you know most of them are. Just as a side note, the last strong third-party candidate in a presidential election, meaning one who received more than just 1 or 2% of the vote, was the late Ross Perot in 1992 and 1996. He got around 10% of the popular vote. Pretty substantial, but alas, Perot didn't win a single state. Therefore, he got no electoral votes in the Electoral College. So in a nutshell, that's how the Electoral College works. But why do we even have an Electoral College? And what were the framers thinking when they created the system in the first place? After all, state governors and senators are elected with a statewide popular vote. Why not the president with a national popular vote? What could possibly be so bad about that? And what happened at the Constitutional Convention over 2 centuries ago that led to the Electoral College? We'll take a deeper look into the history of the development of the college right after this. You know, as a veteran, I loved when people would approach me in public because I was either in uniform or wearing my Gulf War veteran cap and then pleasantly thank me for my service. It's a great feeling to be remembered. That's why I support the Paralyzed Veterans of America. Folks, I returned from 2 mobilizations just fine. but many vets did not, and continue to struggle after their tours of duty. Since 1946, the Paralyzed Veterans of America helps these honorable men and women lead more independent lives. The PVA also leads the charge in advocacy for life-changing spinal cord injury research. Please give what you can to this most admirable veterans organization. When you receive their request in the mail, or give securely online at www.pva.org. That's www.papavictoralpha.org. Even small donations are appreciated. Give to the Paralyzed Veterans of America today. Welcome back. In 1787, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention asked themselves, how should the nation elect its president? Several options were debated, some reasonable sounding, like having the Senate choose the next national executive, and some absolutely outlandish, like a proposal to have congressmen draw straws to see who would be on a committee to choose the president in secret. Well, more reasonable heads quashed that idea, but those same reasonable heads were also roundly, vastly opposed to a general popular vote to decide the presidency. Their reasoning in implementing the Electoral College carried legitimacy based on concerns as applicable today as they were in 1787. A balance had to be achieved between the votes of the common man and the filtering of group representation implied in a republic representative democracy. As you might know, that makes the 2016 election a case study in why the Electoral College will always be needed. James Madison, the key architect of the Constitution, said he saw the benefit of a direct election for president, but identified two key concerns in that day. The most prominent concerns were the same then as they are today. And if you follow and study the Constitutional Convention's discourse around the Electoral College, the disproportional number of votes over America's vast geography was, as today, a huge concern. At that time, it would have been Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia, and to a lesser extent Atlanta and Richmond. Big population centers are more likely to be of a like mind by comparison than when comparing Houston, Texas to, let's say, the Texas Northern Panhandle, or Brooklyn, New York to the larger but more sparsely populated Adirondacks and Finger Lakes regions upstate. State cultures vary from one another, even within states' borders, as was just mentioned. One district or area will not share the same views and principles as another. A national popular vote will dismiss the voice of the common man and woman to the mob rule or major population centers forever. In 2016, remember, President Trump was even winning the popular vote until Los Angeles County, California. I could stop right there, without a need to elaborate further, but the authors of the Constitution knew that the tyranny of mob rule would be a long-term destruction of the Republic, exacted on it by major urban areas. Yes, folks, even in 1787 it was recognized that those locations were powerful voting blocks. A few places with a high concentration of people should never dominate. Another serious concern in that day, which helped the idea of an electoral college become a reality, was the acknowledgement that voters are more likely to cast a ballot for someone from their own state. We see this today too, but it's not as likely to throw an election now as 240 years ago. Still, if you're old enough to remember the 1984 presidential election, you'll recall that President Reagan's opponent, Walter Mondale, won only one state, Minnesota, his home. Of even greater and far more legitimate concern at the Constitutional Convention was the push by some of the participants to have the Senate or all of Congress choose the president. But that was shot down immediately too, because James Madison correctly identified that since the government is to serve the people, a president chosen by Congress would be more likely to render decisions in favor of Congress than the people. So, deciding against mob rule and then against an oligarchy or a government run by only a handful of men, the reasonable balance of power compromise was a popular vote for representatives to cast ballots for president, or the Electoral College. The sole viable complaint against it is that a president can be elected while not having a majority of the popular vote. This has happened in about 10% of all elections we've had in the United States, most recently in 2016, as has been mentioned, when President Trump won handily in the Electoral College, but was second to Hillary Clinton by a few million votes. The latest three-way race, in which the winner had less than 50% of the popular vote, but won a huge majority of the Electoral College, was in 1992, when Bill Clinton won a decisive 68% of the Electoral College votes, but only received 43% of the popular vote. So what does all this indicate, at least, as far as William Jefferson Clinton?
I'm author Richard Paul Evans. 20 years ago, we created the Christmas Box House to protect and care for abused and neglected children. Did you know we've protected more than 125,000 children? That's enough to fill every seat in both the University of Utah and BYU football stadiums. Did you know we've been helping the victims of human trafficking for more than 20 years, long before people were even talking about it? Did you know that last year alone we served almost 9,000 children, providing 12,000 days of care? That's more than 32 years of care in the last 12 months. Did you know that with more than 700 volunteers, we provided Christmas for nearly 3,000 at-risk children? Did you know that we need your help to do all this? This pandemic has been hard on everyone, but especially these children. If you or your business would like to help through donations or volunteering, we'd love to meet you. Find the Christmas Box House online and go to our website. And thank you for caring.
Welcome back. Right before the break, the 1992 election was identified as one of those elections where the victor, in this case Bill Clinton, won in the Electoral College while not receiving 50% of the popular vote. The third-party candidate that year, some of you may recall, was the late Ross Perot, a Texas billionaire who funded his own campaign. The GOP candidate was incumbent George H.W. Bush, who was actually favored to win. So how did Clinton pull it off? Well, in his campaigning, Clinton had the advantage of being vibrant, energetic, with camera appeal, and, of course, he possessed his own unique manner of charm and appeal. He also appeared to be a new face for government after 12 consecutive years of GOP leadership up until that point. Clinton was from the typically conservative South and swung his home state of Arkansas and a few others Democrat. But as he toured the U.S. promoting the Democratic platform and providing possible voters with his vision for America's future might be, he was building a consensus, a broad supportive coalition that prevents any chance of a regional power vacuum that overwhelms the rest of the nation. If regionalism, a big issue post-Civil War as the reconstructed South began voting again, showed, one heavily populated area can overwhelm the will of the rest of the nation. To put this in modern perspective, if all the small states in the Union decided to vote one way, and by small I mean the ones with only 3 or 4 electoral votes, then Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, Rhode Island, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. would be more than overwhelmed by either Texas or California alone. If a president is going to win election, he or she has to do it with a broad appeal to the people of many areas, not just a few areas of supermajority popular votes. Or a large region, let's say the South, can't dominate a presidential election. According to Trent England, author, attorney, and constitutional expert at George Mason University, quote, "The Electoral College continues to push parties and presidential candidates to build broad coalitions. The concern that swing states get all the attention because of our system is false." England, in a recent issue of Imprimis, a publication of Hillsdale College, went on to state that, quote, "Swing states are typically ones with a divided government. And if divided government is good for anything, it is accountability, since both parties there hold more than just a nominal power." Unquote. All that's been said so far seems pretty reasonable, sensible, and historically based right from the drafting of the Constitution. So why do so many politicians have bad things to say about it? The Electoral College. Despite its previously discussed benefits, it has many opponents. In 2000, after George W. Bush won the presidency by a slim margin in Florida, Hillary Clinton said, quote, "It's time to do away with the Electoral College," unquote. Of course, we know she only said that because a conservative won the election and Al Gore lost. It's not an outdated system, and similar procedures for elections of national leaders exist in Canada, Israel, the UK, Germany, Italy, and India also have a similar system to an electoral college. In these nations as well, the national popular vote is not decisive. After the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the screeching, whiny voices on the left were more obviously upset than they had been since the 2000 drama. The cabal of Democrats running for president in 2020 have all called for the dissolving of the Electoral College. Beto O'Rourke, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Kamala Harris even saying it's a racist holdover. As usual, the appeal to the emotionally trite association with race is an unmitigated lie. A somewhat recent development in the war on the equitable Electoral College is the silently growing number of states latching onto a provision drawn up a few years ago, the NPV, or National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. The premise of the compact is that a state signing onto it after legislature approval will give its electoral votes to whatever candidate receives the majority of the popular vote. There's one immediate impediment to enacting the NPV. It only takes effect when enough states embrace it to equal or exceed the 270 vote requirement to declare a winner in a presidential election. After 2000 and 2016, you can surmise that the loudest proponents and the most speedy signers of the NPV are heavily leftist states. The current total of electoral votes in the states on board with the NPV? 189. But that includes California, New York, and Illinois. Smaller states will be harder to convince to sign on. The little guy here has the most to lose if the National Popular Vote Compact becomes reality and effectively abolishes the Electoral College. There are a lot more issues with the NPV than one sees at first glance. For instance, would one state trust another state's results? Fraud in one state would affect all others. A unique risk of the NPV is the fraud that will eventually and more likely immediately accompany its implementation. Heavy-handedness, the tyranny of the majority, and fraud were the big concerns of the framers of the Constitution. The National Popular Vote Compact sets our nation up for all three. Another problem with the NPV is much larger and more concrete than trust. The fact is, it's illegal to the point of being unconstitutional. According to Article 1, Section 10, interstate compacts require congressional consent. The authors of the NPV never requested that. That means Congress never approved it. But even if that does happen, what if the national public vote passes in Congress? What effect will it have on the U.S.? When a move like the NPV gets rolling, it's only because certain elements of the government feel they can capitalize on a power grab, taking away the voice of the people. The NPV is a manifestation of a government power grab. This can be said with absolute certainty, because there will come a time when some state that is signed onto the NPV has its citizens vote for a candidate who nationally receives less than 50% of the vote. What gives that state the right to flip the electoral votes against its citizens' will? So the majority of the state can vote one way, in some cases overwhelmingly, but have the state-level bureaucrats decide against it. The Electoral College Clause of the U.S. Constitution states in its own terms that there is a limit on a state's authority to ignore the votes and the desire of its people. This is clearly the mentality of the globalist ideology, just on the scale of the state. By now, you've probably figured out that the NPV is quietly, diabolically shifting the common man and woman's power to large urban centers. It's an effort to neuter the voices of tens of millions in the heartland, meaning conservatives. Now, it should make perfect sense as to why the states promoting this constitutional abomination are all leftist-controlled. So the history of its development and use, the identified need for an effective presidency with its authority grounded in a large geographical consensus, and most importantly, the need to keep the franchise votes of the common man alive, all warrant protecting the constitutionally established Electoral College as a great tool against permanently upending the balance of power away from U.S. citizens. As was stated earlier, the United States embraces many cultures and varying social norms that define people's values. State boundaries are also some of the best indicators of what those sometimes subtle, sometimes spectacular differences might be. The government, at any level, has no right to trample upon and suppress them. Is geography a good reason to elect a president? I give you a rousing and passionate yes. If America's leftists want to extol diversity and whatever benefits it might give us, they can start by preserving that diversity we've had in our borders since the beginning, and protect the Electoral College as a mechanism to preserve that diversity every 4 years. So how important is geography in electing a president in the manner of the Electoral College? Does building the broad coalition to win from those many state cultures when locked in a tight race create or at least add to the legitimacy of the candidate and the credibility of their campaign platform, as with Bill Clinton and, let's say, Grover Cleveland even earlier? Does a huge appeal to many locations and cultural units throughout the land provide a more precise definition of the electoral victor? Is winning 40 out of 50 states more legitimate than winning the election by a slim 1% margin? I cautiously say yes. Some of you will favor one quality of the victory over the other, and that's fine. But ask yourself this question. At what point does the candidate's message, as received by our diverse coalition of voting districts, supersede the popular vote? Isn't there a security in knowing most of the nation's constituent cultural centers have affirmed the president's platform and vision for taking the nation forward? The authors of our Constitution knew this was the best possible compromise, but today's mostly leftist Democrats want to destroy that compromise in the name of wrenching whatever power they can away from small population states, more likely to represent the common man and woman, because those middle American enclaves stand entrenched against them, forcing their radical agenda on the people, dismantling your rights defined in the Constitution. The seemingly unquenchable furor over President Trump winning the election in 2016, despite falling short in the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, a good number of which were fraudulent, should be strenuously tempered by knowing that of the 3,142 counties in the U.S., Donald Trump and the GOP's message was well received and given a vote of confidence in 3,084 out of those 3,142 counties. Yes, the assault on the Electoral College must be quashed for the sake of freedom and that historical legacy which protects the smallest communities and the independent voice of the populace. This has been Tom Gandley for Freedom's Herald, your defense against that which would erode your liberties. Special consideration for the production of this podcast goes out to Professor Trent England of George Mason University for providing historical information, and Imprimis, the monthly publication of Hillsdale College, with a readership of over 4.5 million. Read Imprimis because ideas have consequences. Technical assistance has been provided by Brad Neufeld. Thank you for listening.